Hi, I'm Shalane from TSC Tuition, and today I'll be talking about some very serious vocabulary. Given recent events and my experience of working with Victorian Australian teenagers, I think one of the more important things and useful things I can do is to help students and help teenagers decode what some of what they're reading might mean. A lot of the articles and texts that they may come across use words that I'm not convinced is common knowledge for a lot of teenagers. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the more common words that students may come across in reading about this issue and educating themselves about this issue. I'm not going to be talking about the issue here myself, because I think there are lots of other people who are doing a much better job than I ever could, and with more authenticity. So let's talk about some of these words. The first word that I'm going to talk about is racism or racist. Racism, the noun, or racist, the adjective, is used to describe people, actions, policies that discriminate or judge people or treat people differently on the basis of their race. So we may see, for example, in the context of Australia, that Indigenous peoples are treated more harshly, more violently, more unjustly by those in authorities, or by policies, or by leaders, or just normal people out in the street, simply because they are of Indigenous background. And in talking about racism, it's hard to not use the words persecution or prejudice or bias. And in my experience, students find these words very confusing as to what exactly they mean and how they differ from each other. So let's talk about that. The difference between persecution and discrimination is that discrimination can be less active and less obvious. So to persecute someone, you kind of have to go out of your way to do something really terrible, usually, towards somebody else. To discriminate against someone is a more passive sort of activity. So for example, if you're in a shop, you can discriminate against someone by, say, not offering them the same kind of customer service that you would offer to other people because of whatever basis you're discriminating against them on, but not necessarily go out of your way to make their lives really miserable. Bias is a somewhat more neutral word, in the sense that it can swing both ways. So we could have something like a more positive bias towards someone because of their appearance, or we could have a more negative bias against someone because of their appearance. If you're reading about the Black Lives Matter movement or racial inequality, you're probably going to come across the terms systemic racism or institutional racism. Both mean pretty much the same thing, and it is the idea that society as a whole, as a system, if you will, treats people of color or treats people of different colors in more negative ways and offers them fewer opportunities. So here we're talking about things right from the ground up. Right, we're talking about things like in terms of access to education, for example. In Australian context, say Indigenous communities have fewer access to educational resources. Maybe their schools are less funded. They have fewer just materials to help their students, to teach their students. If you don't have a great primary education, for example, then you are less likely to succeed in secondary education. And if you are less likely to succeed in secondary education, you are less likely to get into tertiary education, like a university or getting diplomas, certificates, that sort of thing. And if you have less opportunity to get those kinds of credentials, then certain career pathways are going to be blocked off for you. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, then you are probably not going to be able to afford private healthcare when you need it. And in terms of healthcare, people in Indigenous communities have less access to healthcare because there are fewer hospitals, there are fewer doctors, things like that. So what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic racism or institutional racism is that policies from the government, or that the way the society is constructed as a whole, is stacked against certain communities simply because of their race. A term that's being talked about a lot these days is the word privilege, or the term white privilege. When we look at the word privilege just by itself, it means the right or the freedom or the access to certain things that other people don't have. When we talk about the term white privilege, it means that there are certain rights and freedoms and access to things that you can access because of the colour of your skin. So in Australian context, for example, if you're white or Caucasian, you are afforded more freedoms and access to things and rights than a person who is of Indigenous background. There's a really great series of videos by Beyond Blue, and one of the women who talk about her experience of being Indigenous is that when she walks into a shop, shopkeepers or managers automatically expect or assume that she is going to steal. So they watch her more intently than they would customers of white appearance. So here we're talking about the privilege of being assumed innocent, that you're going to be, going about your daily life not acting in a criminal manner, and that this privilege is not afforded to people of Indigenous background. If you're reading the news these days, you're probably going to come across the phrase police brutality. I think it's important to break down a couple of concepts. When we talk about the word brutality, it comes from the word brutal. Brutal means to show no mercy, to be extremely aggressive, to be extremely violent without kindness or consideration for the person that you are aggressive towards. When we talk about the phrase police brutality, it comes from the idea that the police needs to uphold law and order. If the police is to uphold law and order, they have to be fair and impartial. Otherwise, they would just be thugs. So when we're talking about police brutality, we are talking about the idea that the police, who are supposed to be impartial, who are supposed to protect law and order, they're supposed to protect innocent people, that they are acting in a manner that contradicts what they're supposed to be doing. So when we're talking about police brutality, we're not talking about just the idea that the police are really violent or that they're really aggressive. We're talking about the idea that the police, who have this authority to uphold law and order, are acting in a way that dismantles law and order. So they're acting in this super aggressive, super violent way towards people who do not deserve this sort of treatment, and also that these people don't have any means to protect themselves against the police because the police are the authority here. So I hope that was helpful. I hope this gives you a greater ability to read the articles and opinion blogs and such great resource out there about racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm not going to talk about my own social media channels here, but I'm going to put up some links for the Aboriginal Lives Matter movement here in Australia. Thanks for watching.